Hello and welcome to Securing Your M&A Activity with Cybersecurity Due Diligence. If you're joining us live, our speaker is in the Slido discussion answering your questions right now. For audio and video issues, please click the technical support button below. I'd now like to turn it over to Murray Goldschmidt for the presentation.
Hello and welcome from Murray Goldschmidt, Executive Director of Cyber Capability at CyberCX, the region's largest specialist cybersecurity services provider in the APAC region. It gives me great pleasure to speak with you today about securing your merger and acquisition activity with cybersecurity due diligence. In this session today, we're going to talk both about activities that you should be doing on the buy side as well as the sell side when you're evaluating organizations that the buyers are looking to acquire. And we'll wrap it up at the end with some key takeaways and action items that you should be able to achieve within the next short, medium, and long term going forward. When we talk about mergers and acquisitions in the marketplace, there is a high range of a variety of merger and acquisition deals. There are big deals, there are small deals, and there are some very prominent deals. Generally, when you're dealing with quite sensitive deals, the profile of both the supplier, the profile of both the supplier and the buyer are raised in the market, which may make them more prone to attack, just by virtue of being in the news. Attackers may also be opportunistic, looking to take down a tall poppy just for the notoriety and to make a political or economic statement. Indeed, very high-profile deals, including those operating in sensitive supply chains for agriculture, resources, defense contracts, and large-scale consumer businesses, may draw the attention of even nation-states. For this reason, buyers and sellers need to be specifically prepared for potential attacks and improve their resilience during the critical periods of M&A activity. The deal room, or virtual data room, is where most of the assessment of a seller by a buyer occurs. The security of the deal room activities is therefore paramount. There are various technologies and service providers offering a huge variation in the capability and security in the marketplace. The devil here is really in the detail. In this session, we'll explore some critical areas around jurisdiction, data storage, data retention, access controls, and also application security of the deal room itself. Let's first look at deal room jurisdiction. The jurisdiction of the data room can be very important. When dealing with cloud services, the actual location of the data may be hard to pin down, and you may need to get into really specific details and possibly compliance assessments to validate what a service provider is actually offering in the space. Jurisdiction can be very important for certain types of deals. For example, cross-border deals, where the seller may have obligations to keep data within a specific country based on the regulations under which they operate. For example, where I come from in Australia, deals with government scrutiny and oversight may have specific requirements not only for the data location, but also in restricting access to that data from within a specific country only. Data governance of the deal room is also very important. What data you are asking for as a buyer and what information the seller is providing is really important. Sometimes, to protect anonymity or privacy, sellers may obfuscate certain information such as client names, staff names, and other important information so that if the deal doesn't proceed, they haven't lost a lot of sensitive information. However, at some point, the information that was de-identified will need to be re-identified, and this can be a point of considerable risk for both the buyer and the seller, because at this point, the data becomes really valuable to both parties, and of course, also becomes very valuable to attackers. It is imperative to know, therefore, who has access to that data and ensure that the deal room platform has adequate auditing, logging, and monitoring. If an attack occurs, all this information is going to be essential for any ensuing data breach notification obligations that both the buyer and the seller will need to address. Deal room data retention is also a very important area to consider. Data retention has become far more complex beast thanks to the prominence of cloud computing, data replication, and the range of continuous backup products on the market. This does great things for availability of data, but you also need to ask prudent questions about where the data is and how long it will persist for after the deal room is closed. Service providers may tell you that the data is exclusively encrypted to your tenancy, but wherever encryption is used, equally you need to assess the effectiveness of it, because poor key management can very quickly invalidate any benefit that the encryption provided itself. Deal room access control is also ultimately very important, and is probably the most obvious area of weakness, and unfortunately still remains one area that is poorly implemented. Multi-factor authentication is an absolute must, but it generally isn't turned on by default. And when it is turned on, the methods employed might be very weak. For convenience, most platforms offer SMS and email methods for sharing the one-time password. SMS is inherently weak and has long been known as not being suitable for authentication methods, and many papers have been published with explicit recommendations to not use it. However, it is still extensively used. Email is also generally a weak method for sharing one-time passwords, specifically when access to email itself is not protected by MFA. Think about this. An attacker identifies a party in a deal who has access to the deal room. This party doesn't have MFA on their email, but uses email as a method to get access to the MFA code for the deal room. The attacker only has to compromise the party's email address to intercept the codes and ultimately access the data room. The very best form of MFA remains a hardware token that is physically separated from any computer or mobile device, and these forms of stronger authentication should be considered for more sensitive and high-value deals. Deal room application security should be top of mind for anybody using or subscribing to a deal room service. The security of the deal room itself will intrinsically be related to the security of the application that you log into and publish data in. The security of the application in turn is reliant generally on the way that the application is hosted and the controls inherently in the platform to separate the tenants as these are generally delivered as multi-tenant software as a service products. Will the service provider demonstrate the comprehensiveness of the security controls across the development activities that they do and the operational management activities, the way that they manage and publish this platform on an ongoing basis? How thorough and robust is this? These are all reasonable questions to ask. Will they actually allow you to appoint an expert firm to conduct an independent test? And do you have the luxury of time to do this when M&A is generally a time-bound activity? If you're a buyer that will be operating in the market for an extended period of time across a large number of deals, performing your own due diligence on a data room provider may be an appropriate investment in time and money. Advisors also need to be considered, because a buyer is generally surrounded by a number of advisors to assist with the due diligence reviews. Generally, this includes accountants, lawyers, tax specialists, possibly intellectual property advisors, technology and insurance specialists. Each one of these parties increases the risk profile for both the buyer and the seller. Remember that the motivated attacker will be looking for the weakest link in security. Think back to that email example that I mentioned before. If an attacker has profiled the advisors and determines which ones don't have MFA on their email, they may make them the target of the attack to ultimately gain access to either the buyer's or the seller's data in the data room. Maintaining good security hygiene of your deal management practices is also very important. Sometimes code names are used to lower the profile of a deal. People might call this thing that I'm working on Project Alpha. However, this security by obscurity is generally very quickly removed when that layer of security is peeled back and there is inadequate access control within a business to the sensitive data. So you really need robust governance, risk and compliance methods internally to ensure that your activities that you're doing are secure and that there are specifically restrictions in place based on role-based access controls and limiting things on a business need-to-know basis. If you thought it was hard work just getting to the point where a deal may be consummated, the hard work really only starts after deal completion. Integration of a business is where the real risk is. The acquirer will need to reconsider if the merged business has fundamentally changed their risk profile. Has the attack footprint increased? Is the current vulnerability management practice adequate to cover the larger entity? Do you have the right threat intelligence in place to make informed management decisions? And is your position in the supply chain now under more threat? Ultimately, the business is going to have to deal with the machinations of integration and handling the tech debt that you have inherited when merging two or more established businesses. I know this firsthand because our business was recently acquired and we are now dealing with the realities of merging over 13 businesses together. Let's look at a couple of reference cases where some organizations have really suffered through the M&A activities that they've conducted. A very well publicized breach recently was the Marriott Starwood data breach. This issue resulted in the loss of over 380 million customer records as a result of a breach in the reservation system. The cost of this breach is reported to be north of $70 million, and was the breach actually occurred prior to the acquisition. Had Marriott been aware of the breach during the due diligence stage, it could have been dramatically affecting the vision that Marriott may have had on the valuation of the party that they were looking to acquire, and possibly even the prospect of a deal occurring may not have transpired. Telstra and PacNet. Well, Telstra is Australia's largest telecommunications provider, and PacNet is an operator of undersea cables and data centers. Telstra acquired PacNet only to find out afterwards, after the deal completion, that a breach had occurred actually 2 weeks before the deal had closed. You'd be thinking that they might be reconsidering the approach that they take to cybersecurity due diligence in mergers and acquisitions, because if a breach was actually occurring during the time in which the due diligence was occurring, that should have been brought to their attention. Both the seller should have been aware of it, and the buyer certainly should have been able to pick up on poor security controls during the due diligence activities. PayPal also similarly acquired a payment processor, TIO, in 2017, only to find out later that the entity was compromised some 3 years earlier. So as you can see, there are a number of case studies demonstrating that cybersecurity due diligence practices absolutely need to be front and center, and certainly may affect the valuation of deals and even the prospect of a deal actually occurring. Up until this point, we've been focusing on what buyers need to be doing in terms of securing their own practices, in terms of their go-to-market strategies of being a buyer in a merger and acquisition activity. Let's look now at the sell side. What would the buyers be looking for in terms of the seller's security? And how would the buyer validate if the organization that they're looking to acquire is actually as secure as they purport to be? Let's consider first supply chain. Companies that are integral to some function in the supply chain are naturally very attractive to buyers because they may be able to get a fast return on investment through a well-managed business expansion plan. But they are also very attractive to attackers because if you control the supply chain, you can control the product of the supply chain. If anything, COVID-19 has tangibly demonstrated how fragile our supply chains can be. Transportation, logistics, airlines, and hotels are all impacted as we speak. A cybersecurity issue could also result in the same sort of disruption. When we look at supply chains, we've got to look at a number of different variations within the supply chain. Software, are you buying or selling? Are you developing? Are you consuming? Hardware, who is actually producing the hardware? Where do you get it from? And which components in the hardware are you actually acquiring and selling? And in terms of services, there have been a number of outsourced parties in the past who have been compromised specifically because service providers generally have maintained privileged access to their customer tenancies and customer environments. Remote access is generally weak, and as we've seen before, multi-factor authentication is generally either not in place or poorly implemented, making managed service providers who are delivering services on behalf of their clients a very ripe target for attackers. Data is generally the crown jewels of an organization. Poor security around data protection is likely to be the area where the wheels come off and things start falling apart. Look at any of the published data breaches and you will see commonalities. Most organizations are still fixated on perimeter security controls like firewalls and endpoint security controls like antivirus, but they're looking at those things in isolation. Company data exists in an ecosystem, and the data itself needs to be protected, along with the networks, applications, and people who access it. When a buyer is assessing a company to acquire, the assessment needs to validate the maturity of the organization, the organizational management of that data, along with the efficacy of the controls implemented to protect the data. Examples to consider for governance include data management models, data custodians, data stewards, and data owners, their roles and their responsibilities. Is someone in the organization actually accountable for data security? Remember, responsibilities will default to the directors of the business, and you can't run away from that. You've also got to think about where the data is, who has access to it, and how it is protected. Encryption is still amongst the best ways of protecting data, but is only as good as the key management around it. Hard coding the decryption keys into your applications or associating the key with the data that is encrypted makes protection almost useless. So crypto and key management are essential areas to assess. In modern cloud and in everything connected environments, data doesn't reside in one place. Data is very mobile and very likely to be continuously replicating. Having poor data security practices up front can rapidly become a major problem when the data is replicated across cloud environments and mobile devices. When assessing the security of a firm that you're looking to acquire, it would be a good idea to validate the resilience that they have against common cyber attacks. If the organization has a robust vulnerability management program, perhaps they would be open to sharing the results of scans and tests conducted. Remember that when it comes to penetration tests, there can be a huge variation in the types of tests conducted and the quality of the test. Penetration testing is a specialty discipline, and the astute buyer will need to assess the extent to which the seller has really tested the breadth and depth of their footprint. A narrow scope of a test may look only at public-facing network IP addresses, for example, whereas a more thorough penetration test would be looking at social engineering, physical security, networks both internal, external, and cloud, web applications, APIs, client-server applications, voice over IP, and a whole range of other types of technologies in the environment. If time allows, a buyer should consider appointing a specialist testing firm to conduct a comprehensive assessment that simulates genuine cybersecurity attack vectors. This is often referred to as red team testing. There's also a huge difference between being compliant and secure. Buyers should not only rely on compliance certifications alone. Being compliant doesn't mean being secure. Many organizations do not appreciate or understand the difference between the different types of certifications that exist in the marketplace. For example, ISO 27001 is a very popular global standard for information security management, which is based on developing a management system to assess risk and implement controls to maintain risks within the risk appetite of the business. Businesses with higher risk appetites, for example, startups, may be prepared to accept risks that more established businesses would not. While they may be compliant in terms of operating a functional information security management system, this doesn't mean that the organization is secure, not at all. PCI DSS, on the other hand, is a very technically focused standard relevant specifically to merchants and service providers handling credit card data. Organizations can validate their compliance by very different means under this particular compliance standard, through either self-assessment or independent assessment through a qualified security assessing company. Now, there is a huge difference in the confidence that a buyer can deduce from an independent assessment versus self-assessment, where it becomes increasingly very easy and perhaps capable for the organization to insert a yes response because it is very convenient to want to be secure, and self-assessment has no external scrutiny. So you really need to ask detailed questions to get access to the details about compliance and thoroughly assess the information and reporting behind the certification. Let's have a look at a sample test that an organization may be prudent to undertake. We call this a dynamic risk assessment. I'll give you an example here of a risk assessment that we were appointed to conduct by a client of ours. They had made a substantial investment in information security over the years. They operated an ISO 27001 information security management system. They had acquired every type of security technology you can think of, from next-gen firewalling to endpoint security, and it also outsourced security operations and management to 24/7 operation centers. Our client wanted to validate if the controls that they had so diligently implemented were actually working. They asked us to passively assess their business by performing reconnaissance on their public footprint, including their staff access and their social media profiles that are publicly available. We were instructed to initiate targeted social engineering attacks against specific individuals that were likely to be targeted by cyber criminals. We followed this attempt through further attempts to gain access to their physical office premises, again through social engineering means. A range of digital attack vectors were then executed with the objective of establishing a presence on the corporate network and then maintaining persistence so that the attack could be controlled remotely from the comfort of our offices. Our client wanted us to see if we could determine what their crown jewels were in this case, where they were, and ultimately if we could access them and get them out of the network. This would establish a worst-case scenario if this was replicated in a genuine cyber attack with nefarious motives. Our client also wanted to determine if their 24/7 security operations center would identify and prevent any of the attacks from occurring. Now, in this case, the results of the assessment were very interesting. Because our client had generally good controls in place and were very diligent in their information security management practices, there were no specific vulnerabilities on any networks or applications. This makes execution of an attack much more difficult because attackers generally look for vulnerabilities to exploit using commonly available tools to get an initial foothold into an environment. When there are no vulnerabilities to exploit, the attacker or tester needs to be far more skilled, creative, and resourceful in the way that they approach the problem. We call this a living off the land attack because you can only use the tools and applications that are native in the environment to try and escalate your privileges and work your way through the maze of their environment. I don't have time to go through all the techniques used in this particular assignment. However, if you're interested in it, we've written a white paper which is accessible on our webpage, and you're welcome to contact me after the session, and I can share that information with you as well. In summary, we were able to totally compromise the environment, move laterally across their network, access their data stores, exfiltrate their data, and decrypt it. And you know what? None of this was even observed by the Security Operations Center that they were paying a handsome penny to month after month after month. Essentially, all their investment in technology and services was null and void. An assessment such as this could reasonably simulate the types of attacks that an organization may be subjected to by motivated attackers post-acquisition. Indeed, the organization may have already been compromised through such techniques, as you could see through the examples of the case studies that I shared with you previously. Such an assessment could completely change the perspective of the buyer in terms of the risk and value of the target, and therefore make the legal and financial due diligence less relevant. Let's now look at applying the learnings that we've identified today to practical outcomes for both buyers and sellers. On the buyer side, you should be looking in a very short period of time to assessing data room technologies. Make your selection based on capability, resilience, track record, authentication capabilities, and also access control options. You should also be looking to identify your third-party footprint. Remember that the third parties are increasing your risk profile in the marketplace, and attackers will be looking to exploit the weakest link in the chain. So think about the security that your lawyers have in place, your accountants and your external advisors, and you may need to elevate their capabilities as well if you're going to be working with them on an ongoing basis. Within the first 3 months following this presentation, you should be in the position to establish firm protocol for data room access, including third-party security controls as well. You should be able to validate the security of your third-party ecosystem. You should also be able to implement robust cybersecurity assessment plans for the acquisitions that you plan to do currently and going forward. And you should also be able to test your own incident management and response capability. Remember that as a buyer, your risk profile increases as you become known in the marketplace for looking for acquisitions, particularly if they are high profile, high value, and sensitive acquisitions, possibly with nation state interest. Let's look now at the sell side as well. If you're a seller, next week, you should be able to be prepared to respond to a more astute buyer. Assess the data room technologies, as I mentioned before, on the sell side. You should, if you're in control of your go-to-market strategy, you should be selecting the data room based on its capability, the service provider's capability, their resilience, their track record, and their authentication and access control options. Remember, you should be enforcing the strongest form of authentication so that any buyer or interested party and their ecosystem should not be compromising your security of the data that you're posting into the data room when you're in control of it. You should also be preparing your go-to-market approach so that buyers will be following your lead. So you should be specifying the forms of authentication and role-based access control that you want to minimize the exposure of your data in your data room. Remember that you shouldn't be publishing legal information to accountants, and you shouldn't be exposing accounting information to lawyers unless there is a specific business need to know. Within 3 months following this presentation, you should be able to appoint a firm to conduct a red team test or a dynamic risk assessment, similar to the one that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago. This is the best way of validating your compliance position and mapping the technical controls and against whether or not they're actually working. Remember, being compliant and being secure are totally different prospects. You should be able to demonstrate that your incident management activities, your response is effective. And you should ensure that when you've got outsourced IT security management, that your service providers are doing a thorough, good, and comprehensive job for you. The best way of doing this is by running a cybersecurity simulation, attack simulation by an expert firm. And within 6 months, you should be able to implement threat management and continuous monitoring to demonstrate your ongoing visibility of security issues so that there are no surprises for the buyers. With that, I'm going to close off the session. It's been a great pleasure to be with you. I'm Murray Goldschmidt, the Executive Director for Cyber Capability, Education and Training at CyberCX. My contact details are on the screen now. Feel free to contact me after the presentation. I also hope that you've been using the on-room chat, and I'll be able to respond to those things now. Thank you very much. Take care.